Hello and welcome to Genre Blender, the podcast about all things storytelling. My name is Ryan.
And I'm Kris, and today we are talking about modern versus classic fiction. Quite a big topic that we have here today, and I was saying to Ryan earlier, I've been deep in the internet rabbit hole looking at what makes a classic a classic.
You did the homework and I didn't get the memo to do the homework. That's okay.
I didn't do any homework on modern fiction, so maybe you can say that side of the coin.
I mean, don't trust me with that one. That's probably a bad idea. I'm sure between the both of us we'll manage though. But it's funny how we're doing all these like big topics right at the beginning of our podcast.
Got to start it off right.
Yeah.
But first, we should do a check-in on what we have watched, played, read over the last couple of weeks. It's been a couple of weeks since we've had a chat. So,
yeah.
What have you been up to? What have you been consuming in the world of media?
Yeah, I've basically just been continuing on with the same books from last time. So I finally finished The Shining. Have a lot of thoughts on that one, actually.
How did you find The Shining? Because it's not my favourite.
It's not my favourite either. There's something that both Salem's Lot and The Shining does, both very similar. And I mean, both of these are so early in his career, so I'm sure everything changes and gets better and all of that. But I did notice that there's a point basically in the middle of both of the books where all of the characters, this is not really a spoiler by the way, just for anyone, not that these are new books or anything, but where all the characters in the books kind of know what's happening and the mystery just disappears. And so at that point, and it's basically right in the middle of both of these stories, I kind of lost interest both times. Not to the point where I put it down. Like I did finish both and I did still enjoy both of them. But there's just like all of the mystery just goes away. So I think the Shining did that even more so. I didn't hate it though. It was entertaining. I like Stephen King's writing. The writing is what keeps me coming back. So I'm continuing on. There's plenty more books.
Interesting to see what happens as this project progresses and you go further into Stephen King's career, because for me, like, I also enjoy Stephen King's writing, but the stories themselves can be hit or miss. So you get one that slaps, as the kids say. And it's fantastic, like, the whole way through. But I know that he has spoken about previously that he doesn't like writing endings, and, like, you can sort of tell that in some of his bigger works in particular. So when you get things like The Stand, which I think is pretty close for you if you're going in publication order.
Yeah, it's not too long. Yeah.
The end of that may annoy. I know it's annoyed quite a few people in the past. I personally found it fine. But yeah, it's just interesting to watch you go through this journey as someone who read a lot of Stephen King growing up.
Yeah, I'm sure this is quite entertaining for you.
Yeah,
I wonder if that's why, is that why Stephen King's books are all so long? Because he just doesn't know how to end his stories?
He just keeps going. He just doesn't want to end it.
Keep going.
Yeah. I don't know.
Anyway, I finished Old Man's War. It was entertaining. It was very fun. That's all it was for me. I'm fine with it. It's good. And then, I started reading Annihilation. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But I just started reading that last night. But I do have a film to mention, because I did actually watch a film for a change. And it's a little bit of an interesting one. I mean, I'm glad that we chose to use the explicit tag for this podcast.
Oh, okay.
Just in terms of reference to what I'm about to say. There's a film called Love Lies Bleeding. I don't know if you've heard of this.
Oh, yeah. I've also watched that very recently.
Have you really?
Yeah.
So that was an interesting one, and I'm sure when we talk about our queer films and movie and books and stuff topic down the road, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in that. But this one was very, very artsy. Very much so.
I thought I was going in about a feel-good movie about lesbians in boxing, and it was just not.
Wasn't that?
Not that.
Completely the opposite of that. Yeah, very unsettling film. I'm still thinking about it since I stopped watching it, and I think I'll be thinking about it for a good while. But
have you finished it? Like, did you complete the watch? Like, that end scene is just
I don't even. It's like a big drug trip, honestly. Yeah. Anyway, so I watched that.
It lost me about 15 minutes from the end. What is happening?
But
I kind of love those movies, though, where you walk away from it and you're like, I have no idea what has just
What did I
occurred
just watch?
to me.
Yeah, I didn't hate it. I'm quite intrigued by the whole experience. But yeah, I was not prepared. Basically, that was my takeaway. I was not prepared for that film. So yeah, trigger warnings galore for anyone wanting to watch that movie. Maybe do your homework before you press play. But yeah, and that's it. And I haven't been playing anything at all. So yeah, that's literally it for me. Worst reading week for me. And yeah, I watched a movie. Hey, how about you?
I've read and watched a lot in the past week. So I came back from Brisbane and had sort of just done that for most of this week. So I'll try and keep it relative to what we talk about on the podcast. So I've been reading a book called Club Contango by Eliane Boey, who
Oh, nice.
it's like a fever dream. It's like cyberpunk and sci-fi threw up in a book, and like the chapters are very disjointed. It's almost like we're running through our main character Connie's sort of headspace as she goes through this effectively space station, and we sort of get little glimpses of her life and her contacts, and it, even though it's disjointed, it absolutely works for the style of storytelling that the author is going for. I can like if I'm thinking of how to put it into a context that people may understand, it's like, when you start a game as a character and you need to find out what the hell you're doing. So you go and you talk to all the different NPCs to start building what your life is up in your head, so you can start to get a real feel for who you are, and that way know how to then make your actions. That's sort of what it feels like
Oh
as
wow.
we're going through, and I'm learning little bits and pieces from these different contexts from her kid, from like they run an illegal casino and she's in trouble, like in debt and stuff like that. So there's like murder mystery elements in there. It's very
Yeah.
weird, but I'm really enjoying it. I don't think it's a book for everyone, but I'm really enjoying it. Very thematic as well, which you may enjoy it because you do like a bit of a thematic read.
I think I might
Um,
read this one, to be honest, because
yeah.
I know it because you showed it on your channel and stuff. And this one, I mean, obviously the cover alone grabbed me. The
Oh,
cover is just
beautiful, beautiful cover.
stunning, but also just the little blurb that you read out. I was just like, okay, that one's
Yeah, it's
intriguing.
very cool. And then yeah, just to again keep it relevant, Jeff Vandermeer. So I'm 2 chapters into Annihilation. I'll probably read the third one today. Trying to read it very slowly because it is such an atmospheric build up, and it sort of demands that you read it slowly and you take your
I
time with
agree.
it. But I know you want to talk about my alien virginity has been taken, and I
Yes, I
finally
do.
watched Alien, the 1979. I would say classic, which is a great segue into this
Oh,
conversation.
100%. Yeah. No, I specifically, so a bit of context. I specifically told Chris, when Chris told me that he'd watched Alien for the first time, I said, okay, don't tell me anything else because you're going to tell me all of this on the podcast because I am absolutely intrigued. Okay, so what did you think as like an overall, because you mentioned, I think you mentioned, well, I'll let you talk about it, but what did you think overall for
I
Alien?
I thought it was fantastic. For a movie that came out in 1979, it does what good cinema does
Yeah.
well, which
Yeah.
is it took a relatively simple premise, one location, so we were basically just on the ship, and it used really good. The acting was great, the concepts were great, and like the way they were dropped throughout the movie was fantastic. Like I didn't
Yeah.
see, this is a full spoiler. If you haven't watched Alien, go and friggin' watch it because it's
Go watch it.
amazing. And I've waited 33 years to watch it. But like the robot reveal, I was like,
Yeah.
I did not see that coming until the
Yeah.
very second that it happened, and that was so cool. But
Yeah.
yeah, the horror elements were great, the sci-fi elements were great. Like only at the very end could you see how it had aged. And that
Mhm.
was just purely because of visual effects. But I gave it a 5 star. Like I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah. I'm so happy that you loved it because it's one of my favorite films. I think I said to you, so I've got two like very action sci-fi horror kind of films, which is Alien is one of them, and then Terminator 2 is the other one, and I love both of them equally. And they're some of my favorite cinema ever. And it's so good to hear you say how much you love this film. That is
No, it
just
was
so
so good.
so
And
such an important part of my childhood as well. Well, not childhood, adolescence, let's say.
I guess from like also a moral standpoint, I really loved that the female character, like played by Sigourney Weaver, so Ripley, basically took
Yeah.
no shit from the men. And at the
Oh yeah.
time that these movies were coming out, it was very easy to fall into that men do this, women only do these
Hmm.
things. And we have used the explicit tag for this one, haven't we?
Yes, we will be.
Great. She was like, "Fuck you. I will be, I will
Yep.
be doing all the things, and you know what? I'm smarter than you." And she was. So I
Mm-hmm.
also
Mm-hmm.
liked that they didn't like focus on hypersexualizing the female characters as well. Like I
Yeah.
loved that because
Yeah.
again, very easy to do in cinema for an easy grab, but they didn't.
Yep. No,
I mean, there was one scene right towards the end, but in
sure.
terms of the time that it was filmed and what was happening in cinema at that time, and not relying on that for the sell, I thought it was really good.
Yeah.
All right, and that's a really good segue. So, Alien is a good segue into what we're talking about today, which is,
Yeah.
I guess, classic media. I more go down the book route when I was looking at my research, but that as a movie and as a concept is something I would consider a classic with a very general definition of something that withstands the test of time. So I
Yeah.
guess I'm going to throw over to you now, because I've spoken a lot, about what would be your definition of a classic, whether it be fiction or film, whatever media.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. It's interesting, right? Because you mentioned you did a little bit of homework before the podcast on this, and I really didn't. But I kind of have just my own personal definition of a classic for me, and it's really kind of two things. One would be it kind of has to stand the test of time. So that doesn't mean it can't age, because obviously there's a lot of classics that feel their age, but they have to still have something that is um, something to offer, I guess. Something that you can still return to that book or that movie or whatever, and it still has something, or it's done it first. It was the first one to do it, or whatever it was. But also, it has to be influential as well, obviously. So I think it's pretty easy just to throw around the term classic, pretty willy nilly, just to kind of say, yeah, that'll be a classic one day or whatever. But I think there has to be enough distance, enough time between when it was published or whatever it was, and currently, for us to understand its relevance. So yeah, it's really those two things for me. It's influential enough in whatever way, and then has to stand the test of time. And that's why I also think you can't just say something is a classic when it's written yesterday. Like, I think it actually has to have existed for a while before we can call it a classic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And you've done a degree in English literature. We were talking previously before, so you were saying something quite interesting about the classics that you were shown or given to study while you were doing your degree.
Yeah, I mean, so I did a English literature degree, so it was quite literally like there's no Russian translated literature that I got to read, so I'm kind of playing catch up with all of that now. But I think even like when you talk about the Western canon, like even that's problematic, right? Like you talk about all the classics in that get studied in universities all over around the world, but yeah, there's so much missing with that. There's so many gaps in that. So I think any definition, regardless of what it is, like even the definitions that are given to you at a educational institution, they're all problematic in one way or another, because of course there's all the Eastern literature as well, and a lot of those can be considered classics. Like I mean, I'm doing a lot of Japan research at the moment for my trip, and I'm thinking about like reading the Tales of Genji, which is it's a classic Japanese tale, and that's absolutely a classic, and it's very old. But I didn't get to read that during my literature degree because it was literally just all of the English books, basically.
It's. I mean, I also feel I've not done a literature degree personally, but when I think of classics, it's a very whitewashed view of what I think is classic literature, and I think that's been fed to us through schooling and my own research. I haven't delved a lot into even like translated classic fiction that's come through. And we have a secondhand bookshop here in Perth called Elizabeth's, and they have a wall of like classics, and I haven't heard of many of them when I go in, and sometimes you just want to go, I'll just pick this out and see what that's all about. But I was researching before we jumped onto the podcast today, and I came across the article from Pan Macmillan, which very much mirrors what you were saying, that a classic novel is, or let's just say a classic, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a novel, is something that withstands a test of time because it is so good, has such a gripping story, and is expertly crafted. But then there are caveats to that, which says that they need to have a level of complexity or depth that enables that story or that media to transcend the time in which it was written. So if I think of even my limited knowledge of classics, my brain goes to something like a Jane Austen, who we can see the influence of her work even in today. If we're talking about modern verse classic fiction, you can see the influence that that classic had on media that we're currently, or people, not myself personally, are currently consuming in this day and age, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, Pride and Prejudice has had a lot of influence on a lot of things and a lot of people, right?
Doesn't it? Hasn't it what?
I actually read Pride and Prejudice in high school. It was one of the few that we got to read, and didn't appreciate it back then. Can't say I appreciate it fully now, but I can at least understand, like, you know, the humor in it was completely lost on me as a high school student. So yeah, it's kind of funny to
I've
reframe
never
them and
read it.
reread. I don't know if I can recommend. I mean, I don't. It's one of those things that you probably, at some point, it's probably worth reading, but it will be a little bit like pulling teeth.
I don't know, because I don't know. The more I read, the more I enjoy like Victorian historical fiction. So I
Yeah,
don't know, it may work for me. I just don't tend to
it
gravitate
might.
towards romance and that side of thing. But
Yeah.
I've recently purchased a Transmask retelling of Pride and Prejudice
Oh,
called
that's
Most
right.
Ardently. So I'm like, maybe I should read the inspiration before I go into the retelling of it. But I don't know. I don't know when that's going to happen.
And I guess that's also one of the things we'll probably touch on this in a minute, but there's so many classic
Oh
books
yeah.
as well, you know, and so obviously, you know, if you're studying literature, it makes it a bit easier because typically you have to do it anyway, but there's so many, and it's like, well, you know, if you only have time to read so many a year, which ones do you pick, right? So yeah, anyway, so there's a whole bunch that probably ones that you should put on a bucket list, you know, before you cark it, but you make your way through those. But
Some
yeah,
of them are
look, that
big too.
oh,
There are some chunky
absolutely,
classics out there.
absolutely, and they're not. A lot of them aren't easy reads as well. Like you want to spend a little bit of time with them, right? Or at least I think you probably should. You don't want to just blitz through them. So they're big, massive time commitments as well. You know, so it is hard to juggle the modern and the classic, and you know which ones do you pick. I actually, just to kind of set the scene here, this year for me, and I think I mentioned it in the last episode, I was meant to be reading all classics. That's why I set my read goal for books for the year really low. I set it to 20 because I'm just like, okay, if I'm going to read a bunch of classic books this year, I don't want to, you know, blitz through them. I want to spend some time with them. I'll just say around 20 books is roughly a good number. But now I'm not reading any. Well, I'm reading Middlemarch. That's the only one I'm reading. But yeah, I think you do want to spend some time with them. So yeah, they're massive time commitments.
On that concept, what draws you to a classic versus what draws you to something that's more modern fiction? So if you had a goal of reading classics and that's gone by the wayside, why is that?
I think it's the mental state you need to be in. They require a lot more concentration typically. I can pick up something like a Charles Dickens book, and it's not a difficult read. You can kind of easily read that. But something like, especially a lot of the Russian translated fiction, the Tolstoy books that I mentioned, Dostoevsky, those do require a bit more concentration, and also the actual like the content in them. They can get pretty heavy. And sometimes I just don't want that. And I think right now I just don't want that. So that's my reason for this year. I'll probably revisit that in the coming years, but yeah, right now. Mm-mm.
And that's sort of what I also have found is when you pick up a classic, the thematics inside of them are very heavy. They are exploring that concept. I
Yeah.
think that modern fiction also does this, and I do want to get into the modern verse classic, not so much a debate, but there is a stigma around people who only read classics and that being better. Very
Mm.
similar to people who only read non-fiction and like thinking
Yeah.
that fiction is not worth their time. But you're right, the classics that I have read, and one of my favorite books of all time is a classic, and that's the Picture of Dorian Gray. But that is so thematically heavy that even though the book itself reads quite light, it's not a difficult book to read, and the themes aren't difficult to comprehend. But because they are so impactful and they still are so relevant in today's society, you really need to sit and think about what you've read. I know that when I finished that book, or even as I was reading it, I really had to take time and think about how that's impacting how I view the world today, which is something that
Yeah.
I think it excites me about reading, regardless of whether it is modern versus classic. if a book can go, that's a theme, and I'm going to deep dive into that one thing and look at it to the extreme, I'm going to be invested in what that thing and what that unpacking looks like.
Yeah, I hear it. I haven't read Dorian Gray, by the way. It's one of the few that is on the top of my list. I don't know why it's been taking me so long, but when we talked about it, I was like, oh, yeah, I need to read that so we can talk about it on the podcast. But I hear it's quite a relatable book because it is like it's a modern. I mean, this is where we can get into like what is a modern classic, right? So
For sure.
I think it is a lot more relatable and, as you say, a bit easier to read because it's you can see the modernist themes in it, right? And it's kind of how we view the world today. But yeah, I have not read it, and it's one that I do want to read. So tell me a little bit about your reading in terms of classics. So Dorian Gray, is that your favorite classic?
My
Picture of
favorite.
Dorian Gray?
I think it's my favorite
Okay.
book of all time. Like,
Oh wow,
so yeah,
really?
it's
Wow.
impacted me the most in terms of everything I read, and I read it way before I started doing anything booktube or bookstagram or book internet related. I read it back in either high school or uni, and like I've revisited it since, and I think the adaptations, which is a topic we'll talk about later, of it have been pretty true to form, and there's one that I really enjoyed, which I'll save for that discussion. But my classics, I really only started getting into them. I mean, I read Shakespeare a
Yeah,
lot in high
the
school.
ultimate classic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I enjoyed some of it. I didn't enjoy other parts of it. I mean, I love a good tragedy. That's also comedic in some way. So,
Yeah.
Shakespeare did a bit of that. Um, but yeah, last year I finally picked up Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I picked
Oh,
up
me too.
Stoker's Dracula, and
Hmm.
that's pretty much where my my classic education has been within those three books.
Well, you picked the good ones. I still haven't read Dracula. That's on the list for me. I also read Frankenstein quite recently. I think was it last year or was it early this year? I can't remember. What did you think of Frankenstein?
I loved it.
Hmm.
Very different to what I expected it to be going in, but again, it's that real deep dive into what makes a monster,
Yeah.
which I loved, and just sitting with the monster as they went about trying to become more human and to make sense of humanity, and the commentary on what people do to each other to either hurt or help. I thought that was really good. And I recently watched, I didn't talk about it with the films, but I recently watched Poor Things with Emma Stone, which is sort of a reimagining of Frankenstein's monster. It's
Hmm.
fantastic. Do not watch on a plane because there are so many sex scenes, and I watched it on a crowded plane, and then I
Good to
had to
know.
be like, I had to like hide it and put it down, and I was
Like
turning the
position the
volume
screen this way.
down
Yeah.
because there were children on the flight, and I'm just waiting for the sounds to stop. And my wife Rachel was
Nice.
next to me, and she was doing these ones, being like, "What are you watching?" I was like, "No, don't look, don't look to your head.
It's not what you think it is.
It's not. Yeah, it's not that." But yeah, I thought that was fantastic. It was another 5-star watch for me as
Yeah.
well.
Wow. Cool. One of the big touchstones on just classic books in general is because they're so influential and because there's so much built on them, it's kind of hard to go through life, especially if you're interested in any kind of art form at all, not having read some of their big heavy hitters because you see them in other media, right? They speak to other films and books and whatever, where that relationship between like a classic book and its influence in other forms of art is important. And for you to get the most out of all of that, like that movie you just mentioned, like you kind of need to have that basis of what the source material is, right? So yeah, I think that's an age thing as well. I think you start to appreciate them more the older you get. Maybe I'm just old. I don't know.
I know what you were
Probably.
saying before sort of resonated where I wasn't ready for some of the language,
Yeah.
maybe, when I tried to pick them up. Because I think I have tried to pick up Pride and Prejudice before, and I was like, no. Like, so
Yeah.
I've never gone back to it. Like I read a page, and I was like, this is not for me. But then I still enjoyed exploring Shakespeare and like delving into what does that line actually mean in relative terms of what I'm experiencing today. So maybe now that
Yeah.
I've done a bit more of that, it would feel different, or I'd be better able to deal with the complexities of the language or what we're trying to explore in those things.
Yeah. 100%. I guess Shakespeare's a good one for that because you see the influence literally everywhere in every book, every film. There's always just a line, you know, but if you aren't familiar with it, it just goes over your head. Not that that's bad, by the way. I should say, like, it doesn't matter. I don't want to come across as too elitist with this either. I think that can be pretty, and please do let me know if I am, because that's the last thing that I want, because I don't think it's necessary. I just think it is something that is worth spending a little bit of time at least understanding what the history is behind some of these classic books and what their influence is, you know, to get more out of even just the modern stuff that we consume today.
I want to talk a little bit about the elitist comment, I guess. Not saying that you are being elitist, but just that there is sometimes that debate of modern versus classic fiction, which is what this episode is about, where people who, or some people, not everyone, who tend to just read classics can look down on people who read modern fiction, and particularly, you know, we tend to read fantasy and sci-fi, and there's a debate in that as well, whether that's a lesser genre than literary fiction in itself. So what is your take on that, of people who only read classics and somehow think that reading modern fiction is not as important or relevant or prevalent?
Oof, yeah. I mean, look, so... Look, I will preface this whole thing by saying it can be pretty easy for me to come across that way sometimes, and I'm conscious of that. So I have to kind of check myself, because I'm not one of these people that thinks that classics are better than modern fiction. I'm not saying everyone should just read classics. Certainly not, I don't. But I also am aware of how, when you're talking about this kind of a topic, I can be perceived as being a little bit elitist in that argument sometimes, because I do think there is a place, and I do think everyone should, if they can, experience some classic literature to understand their modern fiction more and get more out of that. Like, I do think there is an argument to be made for that. But of course, I mean, like, for example, Charles Dickens he wrote popular literature in his time. That was popular fiction. That wasn't considered classic literature at the time of writing. It was literally popular fiction. It was what everyone was reading. It was in all of the, the whatever they call the magazines that you would purchase. You know, you'd buy editions, and all the family would read it together, right? That was how that worked. So to say that, you know, everyone writing, you know, modern fiction right now, especially, you know, all this amazing stuff that's coming out, and the thriving indie scene and everything, right? To say that that's not worth your time, I mean, no, of course not, right? I think it's obviously, there has to be a place for both, but I do think they can complement each other, and I think it is important to kind of understand that as well, and to not maybe put yourself in one camp or the other. And I'm struggling with that balance for sure. Like, that's the thing that's difficult. But yeah, I mean, it has to be both, right? It has to be both. What do you think?
Hard disagree when people are like, classic fiction is superior, and, you know, it's the only way to be. I also appreciate that now that I've read a little bit more and just seeing the influence on what we're reading today is amazing. Yeah. I think I mentioned in the last episode, Dune, like reading that, and also growing up with a father who really liked Star Wars, and just seeing the connections of, you know, what has been taken essentially from Dune and put into a different franchise. Yeah. It was really interesting to have that background knowledge, and also, like, the series that shall not be named, reading some of the influences on that series and being like, this has been blatantly taken from somewhere else. And like, I've recently just read Either World, The Wheel of Time, the first book there, and seeing how much influence that book has had, and that was, I think, in the 80s, maybe the early 90s, has had across the board, is incredible. And that's not classic. I would still call that relatively modern, but similar sort of concept of this has influenced a whole plethora of future works. I will say that classic fiction, and it's funny you mentioned Charles Dickens, because a lot of the classic authors that we have were just writing to whatever market that was going at the time.
Mass-produced marketable fiction,
But there are some, and I'll talk about Moby Dick in a moment, which is one that's pretty high on my classics TBR to read, that have really dived into something that was not being spoken about at the time, which has had an incredible effect on movements that have happened. And that, I think, is worth diving into if you're someone who likes exploring literature as building blocks of not only literature but also ways of life that people live in. I think it's just fascinating, but I don't think one is superior to the other. I think a lot of modern fiction does also dive into very heavy themes, and we're very thematic. Modern fiction. I'm reading Told House by Stephen Erikson right now, which deals with religion and faith, and why is one faith better than the other, and how it can be devastating, how it can be a source of light, and also compassion and death and things like that. It's like they're heavy topics that are being spoken about, and Stephen Erikson is known for a bit of philosophical navel gazing in his 1,300-page books. But which is something that also happens in classic. So one against the other is, I wouldn't say one is better than the other at all.
How do you feel then about, and this is where I am going to sound a little bit elitist. Please don't misunderstand anyone listening. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm just playing devil's advocate, let's say, right? But because there is a very low barrier to entry for writing your own fiction and publishing it, or even, I guess it's the same for filmmaking. You can put something up on YouTube pretty easily and quickly. I'm sure it's the same for any kind of artistic medium at all. But because it's so easy to do now and everyone can do it, that kind of does mean there is a lot of not great, like there's stuff that can be a little bit like, someone gave it a go and that's great, but they're just they're doing it for their own reasons, or, whatever. They've got a lot of learning to do still. It's, they're early in their journey or whatever, right? Nothing wrong with that. But it does make it a little bit more difficult then, because there's a lot more to sift through. So that's kind of my issue with a lot of indie published books, or self-published specifically, because, anyone can just put something up online now. It's pretty simple to do. But also because I feel like there is often a bit of a lack of awareness of classic literature. So where do you stand on that? Because when we're talking about classics not inherently being any better than modern fiction, sure, but is there a standard that kind of needs to be set for that? Does that make sense?
Like, to me, I would say no, because I've been so big in the indie scene. I think the classics do, in terms of language and what they're doing, and the definition is fairly clear cut for me, in that these are things that have withstood the test of time. But there is nothing for me to say that a self-pub book that's come out in the last 10 years won't also be thematically relevant in another, 50 to 100 years' time, even though, there's a whole other debate there with published and self-published works, right? Which we could potentially talk about, because one of us is very passionate about the indie scene.
Really? Yeah.
But I also think that that can also go into elitism, and there are some shit published books out there that have gone through traditional publishing routes.
Yeah.
And there are some fantastic self-published books. And you're right in that not everyone is going to have the knowledge base that, makes an excellent read. But then that also comes down to, why are they writing? And that's not less or more than anybody else. Remind me not to give you my book.
Like I said, I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not saying I necessarily agree. I'm just, it's just an interesting time at the moment.
It's interesting because it is easier. I would say it's not easy, because there are still, yes, people can go and load a Word document up to Amazon and whatnot, but there are still so many red tapes and hoops to jump through to be able to do something like that. But then it's the marketing of finding your audience and whatnot, and there's a lot to dive into.
Well, it goes into it. 100%.
Yeah, into that that whole situation.
Yeah.
We'd be here for hours.
It's not a small conversation.
No.
But I was just curious, because I think that's where I struggle the most, because there is something to be said for sort of reading the things watching, whatever, the things that came before, to understand yourself and your own art better. And I think sometimes in this very fast-paced world that we live in, where the idea that you should read, 100 books a year, and that idea and that kind of culture kind of takes over. And sometimes I feel like people sort of need to take a little bit of a step back and take some time and slow down and understand what is important, and maybe go back and look back at previous books or whatever, and see what those influences are to improve their own, whatever they're doing. But at the same time, you're right. Like, there's nothing that makes that inherently better, right? So
it's all subjective, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Just took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly that.
And you see, like, I've been watching BookTube for a long time. I've only been on the platform for, I think I'm coming up to 3 years now. And, like, I love it. I don't have a huge audience, but that's fine. I'm talking to my people about the stuff that I enjoy, and I don't chase the algorithm. But a lot of what happens with new booktubers is they'll come on and they'll talk about really popular stuff, or they'll jump on hype trains, or they'll read things that they know are going to get attention, like friggin' Sarah J. Maas and all of her books. And like they'll just take off, and then after a couple of years, the pressure will get too much because they have to now read 1,000 books a year or whatever it is that the Goodreads goals are happening. Or they'll start to backtrack and they'll start reading what they want, and you'll see these videos coming out being like, I'm at this point where I do want to read other genres, or I want to read other things that aren't necessarily going to be good for the algorithm. And that's the danger of algorithm chasing and trying to keep up with that mentality, which is another topic I'm sure we have in our episode guide somewhere down the track. But it is interesting to see people who jump on these trends and then go, you know what, I want to read a historical fiction, or you know what, I want to read a classic book. And we are seeing a bit of that, even in my circles, where they go, I do want to see where those influences came from, but I know that's not going to be a sell if I'm trying to make money off this platform.
The audience doesn't want that. Yeah,
exactly.
That's a whole other thing. Yeah, it's true. I had a question there and I've just completely forgotten.
Sorry, I talked too much. No. Just talk around in circles.
Not at all. Okay, no, I do. I remember what I was going to say. You mentioned Sarah J. Maas. I again preface this by saying I've not read any of her books, but okay, something like A Court of Thorns and Roses. Did I get that right?
I read Throne of Glass last year as like a joke vlog, which I think of the YA, the YA series. I read the first book.
So this is a book that is exceptionally popular on the internet. In what world would that be considered a classic? Do you think that will be? I mean, this is kind of what I was kind of alluding to, right? Which is, right, because if it's popular fiction, people seem to love it. I've not read it. I can't say anything bad.
Okay, let's go down the route of the definition. Let's break down Sarah J. Maas versus the definition of classic fantasy. Okay. Or classics. A novel that has stood the test of time because it's so good and has a gripping story which is expertly crafted and brilliantly expressed. Everything in that definition is subjective to the reader.
100%. But it is very popular, right? So it is...
Yeah. But then we delve into the caveats of the definition. Levels of complexity and depth, which in at least the book that I read was not there, subjectively to my own tastes, which enables it to transcend the time in which it was written, which again, I don't think. At least the book I read is not transcending any time. People are just horny. Like, that's
I think that's what it is,
from
right?
those books.
Yeah, that's why. Is that not why people read these books? I just, the way the world is going, though, it would not surprise me if, like, 20 years from now, people are still, like, talking about this book. Like, it's just... I don't know how I feel about that.
The author has done... So I guess that's where our elitism comes in, because I don't gravitate towards those books. I don't gravitate towards spicy books or smut or things like that. I've actually got a video coming out about that soon, about rethinking romantasy, because I have read some which has genuinely made me go, maybe I don't hate it. But then, because I don't gravitate towards it, I'm not going to be able to answer that question, whereas someone who purely reads and enjoys that sort of thing may have a completely different take on it. But yeah, it's definitely not something which I would... Like, I'm not rushing back for another Sarah J. Maas experience, personally.
Yeah, I'm not rushing to read my first one either.
I would love you to read one.
I don't think I could do it. I've thought about just doing it for the fun of
lols,
it. I don't think I would be able to, honestly. And I actually watched... I don't know if you're familiar with Willow Talks Books on YouTube.
I've heard the name. I've not.
Books and Bow as well, the blog. Anyway, awesome, fantastic booktuber, and she's a trans woman as well. She's fantastic. She's a lovely person. But her tastes in books are very similar to mine, and she's kind of one of those people that I trust her opinions when I'm looking for fiction to read. And anyway, she would joke about her, like, you know, basically bashing the book a little bit, you know, and not having properly read it. So she went and tried to read it, and then made a video about it. It's very entertaining. We'll put it in the show notes for her channel. But basically, it's all the things that I suspected is exactly what she said in the video, and so I have no interest in reading it. And this is where, as you said, like, it makes, so now we are sounding absolutely elitist because, I mean, or at least I am, I don't know about you, but, you know, but the thing is, I think I'm okay with that level of, like, if that's the perception of me, I think I'm all right with that, you know?
As long as we own our dickheadery, it's fine.
Oh, the shame. Yeah.
We are going to get shunned by the SJ Maths fans.
I think so. Maybe we should stop there. Yeah.
It's funny because I also watch a channel called My Name is Marines, and she also did, like, she read it. She vlogged this whole reading experience, and after, like, the first 2 clips, she's got wine in her hand. She's like, I cannot do this sober. I cannot read this book
you need to have
without
a glass of wine with
sustenance.
that. Yeah.
And it's some of the funniest content but, you know, it's what you enjoy. The author's obviously done very well. There's a market for it.
Clearly
no
there
shade.
is.
No shade to people who enjoy it.
Is.
Read what you love. Like, who cares?
Yeah.
At the end of the day. Now, I do think we need to wrap up because we've gone for a bit of time. But I do want to quickly jump back to Annihilation, which I think in 50 years' time could actually be a classic. Thinking about the concepts that have gone through. So how far are you into it? Just initial thoughts on the book that we'll be talking about in, I think it's September 30th. I think that
the 5th episode.
Out.
So not the next one, the one after that. We should be talking about it properly. I think I've read almost as much as you have. So I'm about a quarter of the way through it. I think you're a little bit further than me. I've not quite finished chapter 2, essentially. But I mean, this is like my first impression with it. And again, not having read very much of it yet, my first impression is this is the book for me. This is the book for me, right? And I think we've talked about it.
I think it's one of those rare books that we've actually agreed, like, this is good.
This is good.
Yeah.
And it's just, the writing is so good, though. Like, Jeff Vandermeer's writing, there's just something about it, the way he can, and this is why I say it's the book for me, because he can write concisely. These are short books. He can write very concisely, but it's still descriptive as all hell. Like, it's still very visual, right? It's almost tangible. You can almost feel and touch and, you know, smell and, you know, like the details that he puts into it. But he's writing very concisely. You know, he's only putting the stuff that is important and relevant. And I feel a sense of presence with what I've read so far. I'm in the moment. And I'm noticing this because I kind of write quite similarly, and I'm conscious of it a lot. So I really notice it when I see it. But I'm curious if that keeps up, because that's what I'm getting so far. It could change. I don't know. But I'm loving it for that. Like, it's exactly what I want out of a book. I'm curious to see where it goes, though. Story wise, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I watched Annihilation, the movie, a long time ago when it came out. It's quite different to the movie, but the concepts and, again, that sense of foreboding and those discussions of the psychological environmentalism and were all very present in the film. So you've read some of chapter 2.
Yeah, I haven't finished chapter 2.
What I've really enjoyed thematically with the book is the exploration of how beautiful desolation can be.
Yes.
And I think that anyone who's been at a moment of rock bottom and has come out of that can see how beautiful those moments of turning around can be, and that's hit me pretty hard coming from the book. But again, like you said, the viscous on the walls, like, it's so visual.
You're right there.
Like, if you're a visual reader, you're like, I don't want to touch that though, and I don't think you should either.
Danger.
With what's happening in the tower or the tunnel or whatever they're going in. Again, trying to keep it very vague and non-spoilery, because I'll save it for that podcast. But yeah, I picked it up. I put down that first chapter and I was like, yes. Yes, and I really loved the build-up of the psychological element in chapter 1,
Hmm.
coupled with the build-up of the emotional
From chapter 2.
aspects in chapter
Yep,
2, where we
I
really
agree.
get to dive into that character and why they are there.
Yes. I love how it's just peppered in there as well. The pool scene,
Yeah,
again, don't go into spoilers, but the
yeah,
pool
yeah,
scene, how much of that, like I saw myself in that character in that moment. I'm
yeah.
just like, oh my God, this is relevant to me. And I did not expect that, you know?
And it's not so Jeff Vandermeer's writing style is not something that I would normally go into, those short, sharp sentences where it is quite
Yeah.
jarring as you read it, but it absolutely works for the time. But again, I will probably stop talking
Well,
right now
yeah.
because we need to go into it in a later
We'll
episode.
be talking about it for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's it. That's the episode.
Yeah, cool. I think we, I mean, I don't know how much we actually got into I mean, the classics. I feel like I'm scared to go into it any deeper than that because I already know I've said things that people will probably disagree with me quite
It's our
strongly about.
podcast. It's our podcast.
Yeah, that's
But
true. That's
I mean,
true.
look, also encouraging debate in the comments. Like,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
want people to talk about this and to either, don't have to agree with us, disagree with us. Let's talk about it. Let's have amicable discussions about what
That's
you
it.
think.
So yeah, so we won't be talking about Annihilation. Well, actually, all 3 of the books next episode. It'll be the episode after that. So if you are interested, if you haven't read them yet, because the 4th one is coming out. Is it October? I think.
October,
I
I
want to
think.
say.
Yeah, it's either October, November.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're interested in reading it, I guess now's a good time if you do want to chat about it or sort of get ready to read the 4th one. So feel free to jump on that. We'll probably be talking about it we'll probably figure out a way where we can actually have a discussion somewhere, not just on, like, with us as well. I don't know if it'll just be in the comments for now or if it'll be in another space. Maybe that's something we can look into. But yeah, that is definitely on the cards, just in case anyone's interested. Anything else you wanted to mention before we start wrapping up?
No, I think I've gone on enough tangents for the day. Thanks, Ryan.
Cool. All right. Well, you can find the Genre Blender podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok to catch our video content. And of course, you can find us in your podcast app of choice. It's just Genre Blender if you want to listen to the audio version of the show.
We will have all the links to the books and films that we've talked about. Download. Well, we'll have the names of them. Whether I put the links down below remains to be seen, but we'll give it a red hot go.
They'll be in the show notes below, so
They'll be
feel
in the
free
show
to. That's it.
Ryan does all of that, as you can tell. I just sit here and talk.
Don't trust me on it though.
But to all our world helpers out there, we wish you safe travels, and we will catch you in the next episode where we will be talking about adaptations and crossovers in books, films, TV, games, and as a wildcard, stage productions. So stay tuned for that.
More homework. That'd be a fun one though.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Catch you next
Thanks
time,
for
y'all.
joining us.